When Hollywood producer David Brian Pearce committed the crimes of sexual abuse and murder, he was described by a judge as being the worst kind of criminal, and he was sentenced to over a century in prison. So what were the circumstances that led to this case going to trial and such a high level of punishment being handed down? Let's find out. Welcome back, Fridgies, to I Think My Fridge is Haunted, a very creepy podcast for very creepy people. My name is Gemma, and I'm back to bring you another one of my true crime commentaries. Please note, this case details rape and murder, as well as date rape drugs. So if that may trigger you or put you into a dark place, why don't you take a look at some of our other episodes? I highly recommend the Creepypasta episode from Halloween. And we'll be coming out with another double episode next week anyway, so we'll see you then. Now on to the story. On October 29, 2025, Hollywood producer David Brian Pearce received a sentence of 146 years to life in state prison for a series of shocking crimes that spanned more than a decade. Pearce was a manipulator with no remorse whose charm masked a history of sexual violence and murder. David Pearce's convictions include first-degree murder, multiple counts of rape, sexual penetration by use of force, and other violent crimes against multiple victims. And these crimes date back to 2007. This long sentence represents the culmination of years of investigations, complaints, and reports, some of which were ignored or mishandled by the justice system. And it was a pattern that tragically allowed Pearce to continue preying on women until the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola. So who was David Pearce? David Brian Pearce, who was 42 at the time of sentencing, was a self-proclaimed entertainment professional and Hollywood producer. I mean, technically that's what I am, an entertainment professional. I mean, what does that even mean? He could be the work experience kid at Channel 10, who knows? Anyway, while Pearce promoted himself as a figure in the entertainment industry, his credentials were largely superficial, you might say. His IMDb credits include early acting roles on shows like Dawson's Creek and Young Americans, and he was involved with a minor production company called Granite Rock Films. In reality, Pearce was widely described by acquaintances and nightclub insiders as a fraudulent party promoter, someone whose presence in LA nightlife circles was more about social visibility than legitimate filmmaking. Yet, it was this very persona, the B-list Hollywood insider, the charming club promoter, that masked years of predatory behaviour. Pearce repeatedly used access to parties and entertainment events to target young women, using drugs to facilitate sexual assault. Over a span of 14 years, reports indicate that he exploited multiple victims, many of whom later came forward during the trial. But let's look at the fatal night, November 13, 2021. The events that led to Pearce's life sentence unfolded on that night. 39-year-old Pearce met Christy Giles, who was 24 years of age, and her friend Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola, who was 26. They met at a Los Angeles warehouse party. It's also been described as a rave. Christy was a model who had signed with the Wilhelmina agency, which is a pretty big deal. As a teenager, she had been a runner-up in the Miss Teen Alabama USA before she got signed at just 14 to Wilhelmina Models. She'd even travelled to London for work. She was also said to have been great at playing soccer. Hilda, Christy's friend, was an architect. She loved to travel. I read that she had visited at least 22 countries. Hilda had moved from Mexico to Los Angeles to pursue her dreams in interior design, and Mexico was where her extended family still lived. So at this rave in LA where Hilda and Christy were at, apparently they wanted to see this DJ that they both loved play. And I would say there were probably definitely drugs available. There's even a text message between Christy and Hilda at 4:38 a.m. saying, "Let's do a line." What I'm saying is the girls were partying in the way that substances were being used on the night, but they seemed to know when to draw the line, so to speak, and they seemed to know what their limits were. Friends told Christy's husband Jan later that they had been doing lines of ketamine, and when they left the rave, they were completely fine. But Christy's autopsy revealed that in addition to the ketamine that she'd taken of her own accord, she also had cocaine, fentanyl, and GHB in her system. When her husband Jan was asked, "Are these drugs that Christy would take willingly?" he responded, "I mean, that combination of drugs sounds really deadly to me, so no." Let's go back to the timeline of the night of the crime. Around 5 a.m, the two women accompanied Pearce and his co-defendant, an actor named Brant Walter Osborne, who was also his roommate, back to their place in Beverly Hills. We don't know the reason why they went back to the apartment. I guess it's just keep on partying, I suppose, listen to music, watch movies, I don't know. But 20 minutes after they got there, they decided this was not the place for them. Because at 5:30 a.m. on November 13, 2021, Christy sent Hilda a text message saying, "Let's go," with a wide-eyed emoji, suggesting that something was making her very uncomfortable. Hilda replied via text about a minute later. She said, "Yes, I'll call an Uber." Then shortly after, she texts, 10 minutes away. CCTV and phone location data suggest that the Uber arrived and waited for a few minutes, but the women did not get into it, so it drove off. Christy's husband Jan commented to CBS News that, quote, "The fact that they're both in the same house text messaging each other, they need to leave, is very worrying." Later he says, quote, "I mean, it's just confirming my worst fears again, that they were there at that place against their will." And he might be right. Something clearly freaked the girls out. Investigators believe these messages mark the last clear interaction before things went wrong at Pearce's apartment. It's pretty obvious to me that the girls were seeing red flags and getting bad vibes from this situation. And for whatever reason, David Pearce would not let them leave his residence. And it was around this time, if not before they decided to leave, that Pearce administered to both women a lethal cocktail of fentanyl and gamma-hydroxybutyric, also known as GHB, which, if you don't know, these are notorious date rape drugs intended to incapacitate a victim and facilitate sexual assault. The victim is rendered unable to communicate or leave the situation. It could even be that they don't remember the attack at all, leaving them unable to make a statement to police. Or at least a statement that police might find viable. Unfortunately, Christy and Hilda both became incapacitated from the drugs before they could get outside to the Uber. And unfortunately, sexual assaults did apparently occur during this time. The girls remained at the apartment for at least the next 11 hours, and neighbours reported hearing noises such as moaning coming from the apartment. Finally, that night, Pearce and Osborne drove the women to hospital. But they didn't drop both of them off. This is a bizarre element to the case. Because that night, they dumped Christy Giles outside Southern California Hospital in Culver City, Los Angeles. And security footage showed the men dumping her body and speeding away in a black Prius that had no number plates, and both the men were wearing surgical masks. Conveniently, it was COVID time. Tragically, Christy was dead upon arrival. But where was Hilda? How was she doing? If Christy and Hilda had ingested the same amount of fentanyl and GHB, you would think that they would both need the same level of emergency medical attention, right? Well, that's correct, because Hilda was in desperate need of medical care. But it wasn't until 2 hours after they dumped Christy outside the hospital that Hilda Cabrales-Arzola was dropped off at Kaiser Permanente West Los Angeles Medical Center. And they told staff that they had found her passed out on the curb somewhere, and they left without giving their names or numbers. In actual fact, they were caught on CCTV carrying her from their apartment 90 minutes after dumping Christy at the hospital. Hilda arrived at the medical center unconscious and in critical condition. She was suffering the effects of a drug overdose. Doctors did manage to resuscitate her and place her on life support, but unfortunately she was declared brain dead shortly afterwards. and 11 days later was taken off life support on November 24th, 2021. It was just 5 days before what would have been her 27th birthday. But according to Pearce's current lawyer, because he said 7 or 8 now, he keeps firing them for whatever reason. Well, she said to News Nation, quote, "The other person, when they came back from dropping off the First Lady, that's when they noticed that she was in acute distress and she did go on to live some 7 to 11 days. That's not helping." And you can't even remember Christy and Hilda's names? The other person, the First Lady? Later that night, Detective Jonathan Vanderlee was contacted by the hospital and given information about the men involved in dropping the women off. And he quickly found their identities and around midnight was knocking on the door of David Pearce. The detective said to CBS, quote, "I just went up, knocked on the door. Immediately, the lights go out." He identified himself and told them he was from LAPD and waited for a full 15 minutes until finally Pearce and Osborne came out. David Pearce denied owning a Prius, even though a car exactly matching the Prius in the CCTV was parked at the back of his building. So then he admits it's his, but says his license plates were stolen recently. And Detective Vanderlee is like, "But isn't that the plates on the ground next to the car?" Idiots. Detective Vanderlee then interviews Brant Osborne, the roommate, who cannot give him a straight story at all, and he's just completely nervous. Inside the apartment, 2 beds had been stripped and the washing machine was still wet, indicating it had been recently used. In addition, the detective asked to look inside their safe, which contained small plastic bags like the type you get drugs in. But the men told him they keep the bags in there for when they do arts and crafts. I'm just going to show you this excessively dumb picture of David Pearce while we're here. Long story short, David Pearce was already known to police for previous sexual assaults. So soon after, he is arrested and his other victims start to come out of the woodwork after they see the story about Hilda and Christy on the news. Later, Pearce's lawyer, Rhonda Dixon, said that he had been unfairly treated by the legal system and that he had simply found the girl on the road and took her to hospital as if he was doing the Lord's work. But it was too little too late, because Pearce reportedly told a friend, quote, "Dead girls can't talk," indicating he intended the women to die to avoid accountability. Meanwhile, the jury examined the role of Osborne, Pearce's accomplice, who allegedly assisted in the disposal of the victims, though the verdict on his involvement as an accessory remains unresolved after a deadlocked jury. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing Pearce's callousness and premeditation, but it took a while to arrest him. In July 2022, Pearce was formally charged with the murders of Giles and Cabrales-Arzola and also faced prosecution for sexual assault counts involving the 7 other women. Another man was also arrested, cinematographer Michael Ansbach, but he was later released on a $100,000 bond and was described by his attorney as being, quote, "just a witness." On 4th of February 2025, a jury found Pearce guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola, and also convicted him of multiple counts of rape and or sexual assault involving 7 other victims. And here's where we come to some of Pearce's earlier crimes. The murders of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola were the final chapter in a decade-long pattern of sexual predation. Between 2007 and 2021, Pearce targeted 7 other women, using drugs and manipulation to commit rape and sexual assault. Many of these victims reported their experiences to authorities, yet the justice system failed repeatedly to intervene. Multiple LAPD reports documented allegations against Pearce over the years, yet investigations were either delayed, mishandled, or dismissed. This ongoing oversight by authorities left socially connected predators like Pearce to freely exploit their victims without fear of punishment. Lieutenant Calvin Yu said to CBS News, quote, "He has a pattern. His first step is trying to find his victim. So that could be through a dating app, through online listings, or meeting them at bars or events. When he picks his victim, he goes to step 2, which is bragging about himself." Detective Jonathan Vanderlee added, quote, "He'd introduce himself as a producer, as a doctor, all these different things. He's none of these things. He might have been an intern at the time or something at a production company." They say his next step is to drug his victims and incapacitate them, often with a drink. And of course, after this drink, his victim is completely at his mercy. So Pearce's ability to maintain access to young women, parties, and private events allowed him to continue perpetrating his crimes, even becoming more reckless in the process and ultimately leading to the overdoses of Christy and Hilda. So let's talk about the trial. Pearce's trial, which concluded with his conviction in February 2025, centred on 2 main components. These were, of course, the first-degree murder of Christy and Hilda, but also the sexual assault of multiple women spanning nearly 15 years. Because Hilda and Christy weren't Pearce's only victims. He had a series of 7 rape allegations against him dating back to 2007. And these were only the ones brave enough to come out. Lieutenant Yu thinks there might be up to 100 victims. He also believes Pearce was on dating apps looking for women in Ukraine, where he was planning to flee to. Some of the victims of these crimes actually woke up from drug-induced blackouts to find Pearce raping them or sexually assaulting them with foreign objects. While the sexual assault convictions span 2007 to 2021, individual dates or victim identities have not been publicly disclosed in detail, and even in court, victims were labelled as Jane Does. In an episode of 48 Hours detailing this case, the woman named Jane Doe No. 2 in the trial took a drink from David Pearce when she visited him to look at a spare room he had up for rent. Later, she woke up to find herself being sexually abused and managed somehow to escape. She stumbled down the street and locked herself in her car until she felt awake enough to drive herself to safety. During proceedings, the jury heard detailed accounts of Pearce's manipulation and predatory behaviour. Witnesses described a pattern of drugging, assault, and intimidation, painting a portrait of a man who leveraged both his charm and perceived influence to evade consequences. David Brian Pearce and his defence team argued that the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola were accidental overdoses and not murders. Furthermore, they argued that Pearce had no intention of harming either woman. In fact, they said that the women voluntarily consumed drugs that night, including fentanyl and GHB, and that their deaths were the tragic result of self-administered substances, not a deliberate act of poisoning for the purpose of sexual assault. They claimed that Pearce did not supply the drugs or force the women to take them. Pearce also denied drugging or raping Christy, Hilda, or any of his prior accusers. His legal team suggested that his sexual encounters with women were always consensual, and that the numerous rape allegations against him were fabricated or exaggerated, and that he was targeted by women because of his so-called status in Hollywood. I mean, he was in Dawson's Creek. That's like the biggest thing that I've seen him do. The defence emphasised that there was no evidence of premeditation or intent to murder the 2 women, arguing that the prosecution's case relied on moral outrage rather than proof beyond reasonable doubt. As a side note, I think we can argue that the defence was relying on the good old patriarchy for their case, because this is victim shaming at its finest. But that's not all. The defence also claimed that Pearce panicked when the women passed out at his home, and that his decision to leave their bodies at 2 separate hospitals was, quote, misguided, but not murderous. But why stop there? The defense tried to undermine the credibility of several of Pearce's previous accusers, questioning inconsistencies in their accounts and arguing that they came forward after media coverage of the Giles and Cabrales-Arzola case. Well, that's called safety in numbers. If a woman is traumatized after being attacked, it's hard to tell anyone, let alone a police officer. If others come out, it feels like you're not so alone anymore. It doesn't mean that women are making up stories about sexual assault. It means they've been too scared previously, or even ashamed. Some might say it's embarrassing to admit something like this happened to you. It's not something people want to revisit. But let's get back to the trial. After hearing the defense's side of the story, the jury decided they were having none of it. And after 2.5 days of deliberation, they convicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of rape and sexual assault, spanning 14 years. Deputy District Attorney Seth Carmack highlighted the brutal premeditation of Pearce's actions. Those were the deliberate drugging, the calculated disposal of victims, and his apparent lack of empathy. The prosecution argued that the deaths of Giles and Cabrales-Arzola were not accidental, but rather the tragic outcome of a serial offender operating with impunity. And I tend to agree with them. So let's talk about the verdict and the sentence. At the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for 2.5 days, ultimately rejecting Pearce's claims that he did not administer the drugs. And on October 29, 2025, Judge Eleanor Hunter sentenced him to 146 years to life in prison, ensuring that he will remain incarcerated until 2171. In her remarks, Hunter emphasised that Pearce's actions were calculated, manipulative, and devoid of compassion. The sentence included maximum terms for each murder, along with the additional years for sexual assaults against other victims. Pearce was also ordered to register as a lifetime sex offender, reflecting the enduring threat he posed to society. The families of Christy and Hilda expressed relief at Pearce's conviction, but they also highlighted the systemic failures that preceded the murders. Hilda's sister, Fernanda, reflected on years of ignored reports. She said, quote, "They paid the highest possible price for a failure that never should have happened. Had the system acted when it should have, he would never have crossed paths with them." Similarly, Dusty Giles, Christy's mum, praised the prosecution while noting the years of trauma inflicted upon the victims and their families. The case underscores the long-lasting consequences of institutional negligence, emphasising the need for vigilance in responding to early warnings and complaints. Tragically, there was one other victim of David Pearce that did not get to see him sentenced for his crimes. 25-year-old Officer C, known as Jane Doe No. 5 during the trial, was an officer with the La Mesa Police Department in California. I'll call her Officer C since her name wasn't disclosed in court, but the information is available on the internet if you wanted to read more. Officer C had joined the department in February 2024, and she was one of the 7 women who came forward with sexual assault allegations against David Pearce. According to prosecutors, Pearce sexually assaulted Officer C in 2020 while she was unconscious. Tragically, Officer C was killed in the line of duty on October 20, 2025, just 9 days before the sentencing of David Pearce. She was assisting citizens involved in a car crash in San Diego and was tragically hit by an oncoming vehicle, dying at the scene. So why did David Pearce feel like he could get away with these crimes? He used his public persona as a charismatic party promoter and self-described producer to manipulate people basically into hanging out with him. Insider accounts describe him as a fake producer and a total scumbag who thrived on the glamour of LA nightlife. His ability to present a veneer of success allowed him to gain trust, access, and influence, which he exploited to commit rape and eventually murder. Despite attending a UCLA theatre and film program and founding Granite Rock Films, Pearce's actual contributions to the entertainment industry were pretty minor. Friends and acquaintances characterised him as someone whose real expertise was in networking and appearances, rather than actual film and TV production. The David Pearce case illustrates a disturbing pattern in the criminal justice system. When victims are ignored or complaints mishandled, perpetrators are allowed to continue preying on vulnerable individuals. Reports show that multiple allegations of sexual assault against Pearce were raised between 2007 and 2020, yet no real action was taken to prevent future crimes. Let's look at some of the contributing issues we have here. This guy is good at making himself look like he's got this high social status, which may influence police prioritization. He's capitalizing on bro culture. There's also the possibility of a lack of interagency communication. Women going to different police stations in different towns, and those police stations just don't talk to each other. When there's a gap in communication, there's going to be an issue with response, or no response. And we know from serial killers of past decades that if they commit crimes in several different states, they know those police officers are not going to speak to each other. Things are going to inevitably fall through the cracks. Also, if authorities are backseating these claims, they are delaying any chance of investigation. Maybe there will never be an investigation on some of these claims. So even if a complaint is made about an individual, dare I say, at great emotional impact on the victim, nothing may ever come of it. Does it really take someone dying for them to look into it? So here's the question, Fridgies. Had the system acted effectively, could the deaths of Hilda and Christy have been prevented? It's a horrible thought. The case serves as an example of the importance of early accountability and vigilance on the part of authorities and victim-centred responses in criminal investigations. I know that there are men out there terrified of the possibility of having fake accusations levelled against them, and it's horrific to think about somebody doing something that awful. But I also do stand by the hashtag #BelieveWomen. So, with David Brian Pearce sentenced to life behind bars, the focus shifts to survivors, families, and systemic reform. This case is a reminder that the glamour of Hollywood or any high-profile social scene cannot hide criminal behaviour. Not forever anyway. Vigilance, accountability, and responsive justice systems are crucial to prevent tragedies like this from repeating. So what are your thoughts? Do you think that Pearce deserved such a long sentence? Would you be happy if guys like him were never let out into society again? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, Fridgies, be creepy, but don't be a creep.